Oversea under stone. Day 2, Part 1. A white morning haze lay over the sea, and down in the harbor the boat shifted idly on still water, bright under the sun. Jane peered down from her window. The fishing boats were deserted, but she could see two small figures clambering from a dinghy beside the quay. Simon said behind her, "I brought this for you to look after, if you really aren't coming." She turned and saw him holding out a gray woolen sock. It looked peculiarly stiff and cylindrical. "What on earth is so special about your socks?" Simon grinned, but lowered his voice. "It's the manuscript. I couldn't think of anything else to put it in." Jane laughed, took the sock, and pulled the manuscript out halfway. But even though she handled it gently, the edges cracked and crumbled ominously as they caught in the wool. "Hey," she said, alarmed, "if that's going to happen every time, the whole thing'll fall to bits in a week." It was all right up in the attic, lying there for years without anyone touching it. But if we're going to carry it around... Simon looked anxiously at the curled parchment. Its battered edges dark with age, and saw cracks that had not been there before. He said, troubled, "But we'll have to handle it so much if we're going to find out what it means. Wait a minute, though. That room." Leaving Jane baffled, he seized the manuscript and ran downstairs to the small dark door on the first-floor landing which led to the passage they had discovered on the way to the attic. It was still unlocked. He stepped down into the tiny passage and across to the bare, austere room that they had decided was the captain's bedroom. It was just as it had been the day before, and the telescope case was still lying on the windowsill. Simon picked up the case and unscrewed it. The thread of each half was bright and untarnished, shining with a faint film of oil, and the copper lining out inside, when he held it up to the light, glinted dry and clean. He dropped the rolled manuscript inside. It fitted perfectly, resting snugly between the two halves when he screwed them together again. Simon looked thoughtfully round the room, as if it might tell him something, but there was nothing but the silence and the mysterious lived-in emptiness, and he closed the door again gently and ran back upstairs. "Look," he said to Jane, "might have been made for it." "Perhaps it was," said Jane, taking the case. "You'd better hide it somewhere," said Simon. "What about the top of our wardrobe?" "I'll think of a good place," said Jane thoughtfully, but Simon, halfway back to his own room, hardly heard her. Already his mind was racing ahead to the day on the Witherses' yacht, and by the time he, Barney, and father were gone, in a great scuffle of argument over oilskins and pullovers and bathing trunks, Jane was almost beginning to wish she had changed her mind and gone too. But she said firmly to Simon's final jeers, "No, I'd only spoil it all if I got sick." And instead she stood watching from the window as they ran down to the quay and the little dinghy bobbed out to the tall, slim white yacht. Her mother, easel under one arm and a bag of sandwiches and paints in the other hand, looked at her doubtfully. "Darling, are you sure you aren't going to be lonely?" "Goodness, no," said Jane stoutly. "I shall just wander about. It'll be fun, honestly. I mean, you don't get lonely when you're painting, do you?" Mother laughed. "All right, independence. You wander. Don't get lost. I shall be up above the harbor on the other side if you want me. Mrs. Pock's going to be here all day. She'll get your lunch. Why don't you take Rufus for a walk?" She went out into the sunshine, her eyes already vague with shape and color of her painting. Jane felt a wet nose push at her hand, looked down at Rufus's large, hopeful brown eyes, laughed, and ran off with him down into the village through the small, strange streets and the Cornish voices lilting from the doorways of the shops. But all the morning she felt curiously restless, as if something were jostling to put itself to the front of her mind, as if, she thought, her mind were trying to say something to her that she couldn't quite hear. When she brought Rufus home to collapse in a panting red heap in the kitchen beside Mrs. Polk, she was still thoughtful and subdued. "Nice walk. Lovely," said Mrs. Polk, sitting back on her heels. She had a bucket of soapy water beside her, and her face was red and shiny. She had been scrubbing the gray slate floor. Jane said vaguely. She fiddled with the bow on her ponytail. "Have ye's lunch ready in just a minute," Mrs. Polk said, scrambling to her feet. "My, just look at that dog, proper wore out. Needs a drink of water, I'll be bound." She reached for Rufus's dish. "I'll go up and wash." Jane wandered out through the hall, the old dark passage with the sunlight shafting in on one of the old maps that Polly Withers had exclaimed over with delight. Miss Withers, why should she and her brother have seemed sinister? They were perfectly ordinary people. There was no real reason to think otherwise. It was kind of them to have asked everyone out for the day on the yacht. Odd, though, that remark she had made about exploring and finding things. Halfway up the stairs, Jane remembered with a sudden shock of guilt that she had left the manuscript alone all the morning, shut in its new case in the drawer of her bedside table. Should she have taken it with her? No, don't be silly, she thought. But she scuttled up the stairs and into her room anxiously, and felt a surge of relief as she saw the case lying quietly glinting in the drawer. She drew out the brown roll of parchment and took it into the window, gingerly straightening it out. The lines of cramped black lettering gave her the same shiver of uneasy excitement that she had felt in the attic. At that moment, when suddenly they had all three realized what they were looking at, she peered at it, but the squat chunk of words were no more legible now than they had been then. She could just make out the initials of the words that Simon had said were Mark and Arthur. How were they ever to find out what it all meant? She looked down at the bottom of the curling sheet and at the few thin wavering lines that they had thought might be a map. In the dim light of the attic there had been little there to see, but now Jake had the full white glare of midday. She bent closer, suddenly realizing that there were more lines in the map than she had noticed at first, lines so faint that before she had mistaken them for cracks, and among them, fainter still, some words were written. It was a very rough map, as if it had been hurriedly drawn. It seemed to be coastline, looking rather like a letter W lying on its side, with two inlets and a headland. Or was it two headlands and an inlet? There was no way of telling which side was supposed to be the sea, and although she could just see that there was a word written across one of the projecting arms of land, or sea, it was made totally unreadable by one of the breaks in the ancient crumbling parchment, a crack crossing the word out as neatly as if it had been a thick line. "Bother," said Jane crossly aloud. She realized as she said it that she had become determined in the last half-minute to have some discovery of her own about the manuscript to announce to Simon and Barney when they came back from their day on the boat. That was what had been niggling at the back of her mind all morning. One other name was written across the map, if it was a name. The letters were small and brown, but more distinct than those on the rest of the manuscript. Jane worked them out one by one and found that they made three words: Ring Mark Heed. She stared, disappointed. It meant nothing. Ring Mark Heed, she said experimentally. It wasn't even a place. How could a place have a name like that? The clang of the ship's bell in the hall came echoing up the stairs, breaking into the stillness of the sea's murmur and distant gulls, and she heard Mrs. Paul call faintly below, "Jane! Jane!" Hastily she rolled up the manuscript and dropped it back into the telescope case, screwing the two halves tight together. She opened the drawer of her bedside table, hesitated for a moment, then shut it again. Better not let it out of her sight. She snatched her cardigan from the bed, wrapped it round the case, and ran out and down the stairs, two at a time. But she ran too fast. Swinging round a corner of the first-floor landing, she bumped heavily against a long, low wooden chest lying in the shadows and yelped with pain. It would have to be the same leg she had hurt down on the quay, but as she bent to rub her knee, something drew her attention away. The chest she had knocked against was the one that they had noticed the day before, with the lid locked. "Native gold and ornaments," Simon had said, and then found he couldn't open it. But now the lid had sprung open a few inches and was rocking gently up and down. It must have been stuck, not locked. Her collision had jerked it loose. Curiously, Jane lifted it fully open. There was not much inside. Some old newspapers, a big pair of leather gloves, 2 or 3 heavy woolen sweaters, and, half hidden, a small black-covered book. A very dull treasure, she thought, but the book might be interesting. She reached down inside and picked it up. "Jane!" Mrs. Polk's voice was near her, coming up the stairs. Guiltily, Jane dropped the lid and bundled the little book inside the folds of her cardigan with the telescope case. Mrs. Polk's face puffed into view through the banisters. "Coming," Jane said meekly. "Ah, there. Thought you'd gone to bed. Getting too fat for the stairs, I am." Mrs. Polk beamed at her. "Lunch is on the table. I were taking me pastry out of the oven, or I'd not have kept me so long." She waddled back to the kitchen. A mounded plateful of ham and salad waited for Jane in the dining room, like a small bright island in the glossy sea of the polished mahogany table. Beside it was a dish of gooseberry tart and a small jug of cream. Jane sat down and ate everything absently, leafing with one hand through the little book she had found in the chest. It was a guidebook to the village, written by the local vicar. A short guide to Trewhisk, said the little page, in flowing, curly type, compiled by the Reverend E.J. Haas Meller, M.A. Oxon, LL.D. Lund, vicar of the parish church of St. John, Trewhisk. Not exciting, thought Jane, her interest dying. She flipped through the narrow pages full of details of rambles through the countryside round. The words from the manuscript were still swimming before her mind. If only she could have something to tell Simon and Barney about the map. It was then that the guidebook fell open at its center page under her fingers. Jane glanced down idly and then paused. The page showed a detailed map of Trewissick village with every street, straight and winding, patterned behind the harbor that lay snug between its two headlands. The churches, the village hall, were all separately marked. She saw with a quick thrill of pride that the grey house was marked by name on the road that led up to the tip of Kimar Head, and then faded into nothing. But what caught her attention was the name written neatly across the headland. It read, King Mark's Head. King Mark's Head, said Jane slowly aloud. She reached down to the bundled cardigan lying beside her chair, drew out the telescope case, and unrolled the manuscript on the table. The words stared up at her, cramped and enigmatic. Ring Mark Heed. And as she looked, she saw that the first letter of the first word, blurred with age and dirt, might very well be not an R, but a K. She gulped with excitement and took a deep breath. King Mark's Head, the same name on both maps. So that map on the manuscript from the attic must be a map of Trewissick, of that very part of Trewissick on which the grey house stood. The strange words must be an old name for Kamar Head. But when the first delighted shock had washed over her, she looked again from one map to the other, and her spirit sank a little. There was something very odd about the wavering outline of the coast drawn on the old manuscript, something more than the inaccuracies you always found in a rough freehand drawing. The lines of the coast were not the same as those on the guidebook map. The headland bulged strangely, and the harbor was the wrong shape. Why? Puzzled, Jane fetched a stub of pencil from the sideboard and did her best to draw a faint copy of the manuscript coastline over the one on the guidebook. There was no doubt about it. Its shapes were not the same. Perhaps the manuscript didn't show Trewissick after all. Perhaps there were two headlands in Cornwall called King Mark's Head, or perhaps the coast had changed its shape in the hundreds of years since the manuscript had been drawn. How on earth were they to find out? She put the manuscript reluctantly away and stared at the two outlines, one in print, one in pencil, that she now had on the page of the book. But still she could find no answer. In exasperation, she flipped back the pages of the book and suddenly caught sight of the title page. The Reverend E.J. Hawes Miller, M.A. Jane jumped to her feet. That was it. Why not? The vicar of Trewissick must know all about the district. He was the expert. He had written the guidebook. He would know whether the coast had changed its shape and what it had been like before. That was the way to find out, the only way. He was the only person who wouldn't ask why she wanted to know. He would think she was just interested in his book. She must go and find him and ask. And then think how much she would have to tell Simon and Barney when they came home. That was the final thought which decided Jane, normally the shy member of the family, on the way she would spend her afternoon. She turned quickly as the door opened, and Mrs. Polk came rolling in. Finished? Have you? Enjoy it? Lovely, thank you very much. Jane gathered up the guidebook and precious woolly bundle of her cardigan. Mrs. Polk, she said tentatively, do you know the vicar of Trewissick? Sure, she thought, with all those hymns. Surely, she thought, with all those hymns, she must. Well, not myself, personally, no. Mrs. Polk became very grave and solemn. Bein' chapel, I don't have no contact with him, though I see him about, of course. Terrible clever man, they do say the vicar is. Was ye thinking of taking a look at the church, my dear? Yes, Jane said. After all, I probably shall, she added defensively to herself. 'Tis a beautiful old place, long way, though, up the hill at the top of the village. You can see the lower tower through the trees going up Fish Street from the quay. I think I know. Don't get sunstroke now. Mrs. Polk sailed benevolently out with the dishes, and in a moment Jane heard, Abide with me, echoing with rich, gloomy relish down the hall from the kitchen. She ran upstairs, looked hastily round for a place where she might hide the manuscript case, and finally tucked it among the covers at the foot of her bed, so that it could lie along the edge of the mattress and leave no bump. Then, before her nervousness could get the better of her new idea, she went out, clutching her guidebook, into the sleepy afternoon sun. The church at the top of the hill seemed cut off from the sea. Jane could see nothing from there but trees and hills, and even the little village houses ended some 20 yards down the road. The square, grey church with its low tower and the big gate post opposite it might have been in any wooded valley under 100 miles from sea. In the churchyard, a wizened old man in shirt-sleeves and braces was cutting the grass with a pair of shears. Jane stopped near him on the other side of the wall. Excuse me, she said loudly, but is the vicarage over there? The old man, wheezing, straightened himself by holding one arm round to push himself in the small of the back. "'Es right," he said. laconically, and then just stood there, staring without expression, watching her all the way across the road and up the drive. Jane heard her feet crunching on the gravel, enormously loud in the silent afternoon. The big square gray house, its windows empty and lifeless, seemed to dare her to disturb it. It was a very scruffy house, she thought, for a viceroy. The gravel of the dirt drive was clodded with weeds, and in the rambling garden hydrangea bushes grew spindly and neglected, with the grass in the lawns as high as hay. She pressed the bell push by the side of the peeling door and heard a bell ring faintly inside the house, echoing a long way off. After a long time she had just begun to decide with relief that no one was there to answer the bell. She heard footsteps inside the house. The door opened, creaking resentfully as if it did not often open at all. The man standing there was tall and dark, untidy in an old sports jacket, but at the same time forbidding, with the thickest black eyebrows that Jane had ever seen growing almost straight across his brow without a break in the middle. He stared down at her. Yes, his voice was very deep, without a trace of accent. "Is Mr. Hosmeller in, please?" The tall man frowned. "Mr. who?" "Mr. Hosmeller, the vicar." His face cleared a little, though still the intent black-browed stare did not relax. "Ah, I see. Mr. Hosmeller, I'm afraid, is no longer vicar here. He died a number of years ago." "Oh," said Jane, and stepped back off the doorstep, not at all sorry at the chance to go away. "Oh, well, in that case, perhaps I can be of some help," he said in the deep, mournful voice. "My name is Hastings. I have replaced Mr. Hosmeller here." "Oh," Jane said again. She was beginning to find the lone Mr. Hastings in a strange neglected house and garden rather unnerving. "Oh, no, I don't want to be a nuisance. It was only something about a book he wrote, a guidebook to the village." A flicker of interest seemed to wake in the vicar's dark face. "A guidebook to Trewisick? There was some talk that he had written one, but I have never been able to trace a copy. What was it that you wanted to ask? I'm afraid that if you are looking for the book, I can be of no help." "Oh, no," Jane said, not without pride. "I've got one." She held her little guidebook up to show him. "It was just something inside it about the village that I wondered if he'd got wrong." The vicar stared down at the book, opened his mouth to say something, and then seemed to change his mind. He held the door wider open and moved his mouth into an uneasy smile. "Well, do come in for a few moments, young lady, and we'll see what we can do. I know a little about Trewisick myself after my years here." "Thank you very much," Jane said nervously. She stepped inside the door, hitching up the ribbon on her ponytail as she followed him down the passage and hoping she looked reasonably tidy. Not that she would have been out of place if she had been in rags. She thought, looking around her, that the vicarage was one of the most unloved-looking and shabbiest houses she had ever seen. It was big and rambling, with more sense of space than the grey house, but the paint was peeling, the walls grubby, and the floors all bare with one or two faded rugs. She began to feel rather sorry for the vicar, as he strode stiffly along ahead of her. He led her into a room, which was obviously his study, and with a big desk strewn with papers, two battered cane chairs with faded cushions, and shelves of books all around the walls. Tall French windows stood wide open to show the stretch of long grass that Jane had glimpsed from the front drive. "Now," he said, sitting down beside his desk and clearing a space impatiently in the litter of papers on its top, "sit yourself down and tell me what you were going to ask Mr. Hosmeller. You found a copy of his book, have you?" He stared again at the book in Jane's hand. It seemed to fascinate him. "Yes," Jane said. "Would you like to have a look at it?" She held the book out to him. The vicar took it, slowly closing his long fingers round the narrow cover, as if it were something infinitely precious. He did not open it, but put it down on the desk before him and looked at it so hard that he seemed not to be seeing it, but thinking about something else. Then he turned his grave, heavy, browed face towards Jane again. "You are on holiday here?" "Yes, my name's Jane Drew. I'm staying with my family in the Grey House." "Are you indeed? That is not a house I am very familiar with." Mr. Hastings smiled rather grimly. "Captain Toms has no time for me, I'm afraid. A strange, solitary man." "We've never met him," Jane said. "He's gone abroad. And this book of yours," his fingers caressed its cover almost unconsciously. "Is it interesting?" "Oh, tremendously. I love all the stories about Trewisick when there were smugglers and things." For a moment Jane wondered doubtfully whether to mention the map after all, but her curiosity overcame any doubts. She stood up and crossed to stand beside him, leafing through the book to the page with the map of South Cornwall. "This was the bit that puzzled me, the shape of the coastline. I wanted to ask if it had ever been different once." Standing beside the vicar, she could not see his face, but his shoulders seemed to stiffen as he looked at the map, and the fingers of his hand lying on the desk curled gently underneath into the palm. "A curious question," he said. "I just wondered. I see there is another line penciled over the coastline of the map here. Is that yours?" "Yes." "From your imagination?" The deep voice was very quiet. "More or less. Well, that is I saw something like it somewhere, in a book or something. Jane floundered, trying to avoid mentioning their manuscript from the attic without actually telling untruths. If you know about Trewisick, Mr. Hastings, do you know if the coast has always been the same shape? I should have thought so. A granite coast takes a very long time to change. He was staring at the penciled line. You say you saw this outline in a book? Oh, a book or another map or something, Jane said vaguely. In the Grey House? We don't touch the captain's books, Jane said automatically, forgetting that the guidebook must be one of them. But you have looked around them, no doubt. The vicar rose to his feet, towering above her, and reached out a long arm to take a book from one of the shelves. He handed it to Jane. It was very old and covered with shiny scuffed leather, and the pages crackled and gave off the smell of musty age when she opened it. It was called Tales of Lioness, and one of the S's were printed like F's. Have you seen any book there like that? His voice was persistent. He stood between Jane and the light, and looking up at him, she could see nothing but a faint glint of light reflected from his eyes in the shadowed face. The effect was for a moment exceedingly sinister, and Jane felt creeping over her the small, cold uneasiness that was becoming familiar about the holiday, a sense of something mysterious that everyone else knew about, but that was hidden from her brothers and her. No, I don't think so. Are you sure? A title like that, perhaps. You might have seen a map in such a book. No, really, we just haven't looked. Might you not have seen a volume or a shelf similar to this? I honestly don't know, Jane said, shrinking back in her chair at the urgency that had come into his voice. Why don't you ask the captain? Mr. Hastings took the book back from her and tucked it back in its place on the shelf. The grave, near frown was back on his face. He is not a communicative man, he said shortly. Uneasiness was nudging more insistently at Jane's mind. She began to fidget from one foot to another. Well, I must be off, she said, using one of Mother's phrases brightly and hoping it sounded polite. I'm sorry to have interrupted you. She glanced rather wildly from the window to the door. The vicar, standing silent and intent, pulled himself together and moved towards the French windows. You can come out this way. It's quicker. The front door is seldom used. He held out his hand to Jane. I am pleased to have met you, Miss Drew. I am sorry not to have been more helpful, but I must say I think it is unlikely that our coast here has ever had any characteristics that are not shown on Mr. Hosmeller's map. He was, I understand, a cartographer of some repute. I am glad you came to see me. He inclined his head gravely as he shook Jane's hand with a strange, archaic gesture that reminded her suddenly of Mr. Withers when he left the Grey House. But this, she thought, seemed more genuine, as if it were something which Mr. Withers had been trying to imitate. Goodbye, she said quickly, and ran off through the long, feathery grass towards the drive of the silent, shabby house and the road that led back home. Chapter 5. When Jane reached the Grey House, Simon and Barney were chattering like monkeys in the living room to Great-Uncle Mary, who sat quietly listening from the depths of a big armchair. Both boys were glowing with excitement, and even Barney's fair skin had been flushed by the wind and sun to a faint pinkish brown. There you are, darling, Mother said. I was just beginning to worry about you. Simon hailed her with a yell from across the room. Oh, you should have come. It was fabulous, like being right out at sea, and when the wind was behind us, we went tremendously fast, far better than a motorboat, only we came in on the engine, because the wind dropped, and that was fun too. Mr. Withers came back with us for a drink, but he's gone now. Father went with him to fetch up some of the mackerel we caught. And what's Jane been doing? Said Great-Uncle Mary quietly from his corner. Oh, nothing much, Jane said, wandering about. But when all three children were upstairs, sent early up to bed because Father said ominously when Simon imitated a lightship siren right behind his chair, they were all overtired. Jane knocked at the door of the boys' room and went in to tell them about her discovery and her visit to the vicar. She did not meet quite the enthusiastic response that she had expected. You copied out part of the manuscript? Simon demanded, his voice rising to a squeak of horror. And showed it to him? Yes, I did, Jane said defensively. Well, for goodness sake, what harm can that possibly do? A little penciled line in a guidebook can't mean anything to anybody. You jolly well shouldn't have done anything connected with the manuscript unless we all agreed it together. It wasn't connected with the manuscript, not as far as he knew. I just told him I wanted to find something out about the coast. Jane forgot any uneasiness she had felt about the vicar in building a defense against Simon's indignation. I thought you'd be grateful my finding out about the manuscript map shows come on our head. She's quite right, you know, Barney said from his pillow. It's terrifically important finding that out. For all we knew up to now, it might have been a map of Timbuktu. And if it turns out from what the Vicar says that Trewiswick hasn't changed since when our map was drawn, that's going to help us when we find if there are any clues in the manuscript. I dare say, Simon said grudgingly, clambering into bed and kicking off all the blankets. Oh, well, yes it does. We'll talk about it tomorrow. Then we can start our quest, Barney said sleepily. Night, Jane. See you in the morning. Good night. But the morning brought more than any of them had bargained for. Simon woke first, very clearly. The air was still warm as if it had been the day before. He lay in his pajamas, staring up at the ceiling for a little while, listening to Barney's peaceful breathing from the other bed. Then he grew restless, so he went out and padded downstairs barefoot, feeling hungry. If he found Mrs. Polk already in the kitchen, he might manage to have 2 breakfasts. But Mrs. Polk seemed not to have arrived yet, and the house was quite silent. It was not until he reached the flight of stairs leading down into the hall that Simon first noticed something wrong. Always on his way down to breakfast, he stopped to look at the old map of Cornwall that hung on the wall at the turn of the stairs. But when he looked for it this morning, it was not there. Only a rectangular mark on the wallpaper showed where it had hung. And as Simon glanced along the wall of pictures down the stairs, he saw there were several more gaps as well. Puzzled, he went slowly down into the hall. He found several strange, naked-looking patches where pictures had been taken down, and the barometer next to one empty space was leaning sideways. Simon went across and straightened it, feeling the bare wooden blocks of the floor cool under his bare feet. Looking down the long hall, he could see nothing else unusual at first. Then he noticed at the far end, where the sun was streaming in from the kitchen through the open doorway, several of the blocks had been wrenched out and were strewn all over the floor. Simon stared, puzzled. He started down the hall towards the kitchen, and then on an impulse turned to his right and reached for the handle of the door into the living room. It squeaked under his touch as it always did, and nervously Simon opened the door and peered around. Then he gasped. The room looked as though a tornado had blown through it in the night. The pictures hung crooked on the walls or lay torn from their frames on the floors, and the furniture seemed to Simon's first startled glance to be completely buried in books. Everywhere there were books, scattered over the floor, open, closed, upside down, heaped on the tables and chairs, mounted on the sideboard, and a lonely few still lying on the empty shelves. All the locked bookcases around the walls that they had been forbidden to touch were empty. The glass doors hung loose from their hinges, with splintered wood showing round their locks, and 1 or 2 completely wrenched away, were propped against the wall. The shelves had been swept clear of everything they held, and the drawers below were open, with papers spilling from them loose on the chaos of books on the floor. There was a faint musty smell, and a thin pall of dust seemed to hang in the air. For one frozen moment Simon stood staring, aghast. Then he turned on his heel and raced upstairs, shouting for his father. Everyone was awoken out of their early half-sleep by his shouts. Led by father, they all stumbled out into the passage in pajamas and night dresses and followed Simon downstairs, trying dazedly to understand the words tumbling over each other out of his mouth. "What is it? What's the matter? Is the house on fire?" "Burglars," father said incredulously, following down the stairs. "But you don't get burgled in a village like—" Good heavens! He caught sight of the devastation in the living room through the open door. As Mother, Jane, and Barney followed his gaze, they fell silent too, but not for long.